I'm Dr. Joseph M.T., Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai. This is E-Pathshala Project on Religion and Society. We are in Module 24, which talks about Hindu nationalism in India. The idea of the nation is European, and this spread to the different parts of the world. Here we are looking at how this idea of the nation and the community of Hinduism have got conflated to give rise to what we call Hindu nationalism, the idea of the nation of the Hindus. We historically look at where has this come from and its development and its contemporary kind of expressions. This is what we will see in this module. Hindu nationalism. Conceptual understanding. This module deals with the theme of Hindu nationalism and its sociological analysis. Max Weber examines the nation as a prestige community endowed with a sense of cultural mission. Nations, he claims, are too various to be defined in terms of any one criterion, but he affiliates nation to ethnic communities as populations unified by a myth of common descent. What distinguishes the nation is a commitment to a political project. Clifford Geertz, from an anthropological perspective, indicates that there are two competing yet complementary components, ethnic and civic, in the nationalism of post-colonial states. The ethnic dimension is portrayed as a commitment to primordial loyalties which endow individuals with a distinctive identity, the civic as a desire for citizenship in the modern state. Since state and ethnic boundaries often clash, the result is endemic conflict. In contrast, Anthony Giddens presents an unambiguously statist definition of the nation, described here as a bordered power container. This and much else is the subject of a critique by Walk Corner, who rejects tendencies to equate nation with state and nationalism with state patriotism. Like Weber, he defines the nation as a community of descent, but distinguishes it with ethnic communities by its degree of self-consciousness, whereas ethnic group may be either defined, a nation must be self-defined. Ideology is defined by Floyd Fowlers as that part of culture which is actively concerned with the establishment and defense of patterns of belief and value. Ideology is thus apologetic part of culture. It is intended mainly to create a sense of national self-esteem. This approach is not primordialist because culture is not considered here as statically given but as subject to reinterpretation. In this context, it has been argued by Jaffrelot that neither Geertz nor Fowlers places sufficient emphasis on the social background of reinterpreters who shape ideologies. This factor deserves greater attention because the major aim of these leaders is to adjust the outward expression of their discourses in order to preserve what they consider to be the basic values of identity and society. Their choices are determined by both cultural framework and social status. Thus Hindu nationalism largely reflects the Brahminical view of high caste reformers who shape its ideology. In this context, the explanatory model of Anthony Smith for the emergence of ethnic nationalism proves very useful. According to Smith, ethnic nationalism starts from a recognizable cultural unit, their primary concern being to ensure the survival of the group's cultural identity. Hindu nationalism, ideology and strategy. Borrowing from Geertz's definition of ideology, Jaffrelot tries to argue that how Hindu nationalism originated and developed as an ideology. According to Geertz, ideology is symbolic strategy evolved in a society by modernization process. The term in this perspective tries to that part of culture which is actively and explicitly concerned with the establishment and defense of value and belief. And even the concept nationalism is an ideology following the definition. Jaffrelot writes here further in this context. The theoretical perspective emphasizes the instrumentalist idea of manipulative reinterpretations of cultural material. Nevertheless, the model remains predominantly cultural, while the major aim of reinterpreters is to adjust the outward expression of ideology while preserving the basic values of identity of society. Hindu nationalism, invention of tradition and reform movements. This perspective reflects on the idea that how tradition was reinvented in the context of emergence of Hindu nationalist ideology. Jaffrelot believes that if it is possible to analyze this as a subcategory or that can be used as a subcategory of this invention process. This subcategory can be called strategic syncretism. It is because the content of this ideology has been supplied to a large extent by material taken from the cultural values of groups who were seen antagonistic towards the Hindu community. Further, Jaffrelot argues that this syncretism is strategic because it underlies an ideology that aims to dominate the others in terms of prestige and also based on socio-political lines. In the context of the first episode of religious movement, we can certainly look at the reform movement of Brahmo Samaj in 1828 under the leadership of Raja Mohan Roy. His reading of Upanishads seems to be influenced by a mere rigid monotheism of the people of the book, since the philosophy of the speculative Brahmin tended to be replaced by rational theism. According to Jaffrelot, the approach of Roy is syncretic rather than, because he endeavors to reform Hinduism by resorting to precepts of Christianity and Western rationalism. But this syncretism provides to be strategic, since Roy claims that he draws this neo-Hinduism from a purely indigenous golden age which enables him to rehabilitate Hindu identities co-opted by the Europeans. Emergence of the Arya Samaj. Arya Samaj was founded by Swami Dayananda Saraswati in 1875 after being influenced by the Brahmo Samajis of Calcutta. He institutionalized the idea of a Vedic monotheism and joined the criticism of the idolatry of popular Hinduism raised by popular Christian missionaries. Dayananda argued and believed that the so-called Vedic caste system was presented as much more flexible than the one that was prevalent in India at the time. Indeed, he maintained that Jati did not exist in the Vedic times, but that the prevalent social organization then was the Varna system. Reference to the four Varnas do exist in the Rig Veda, the earliest of the Vedic texts, in the hymn X90 relating to famous foundation myth allegory to be born out of the sacrifice of the primordial woman. This fourfold schema is an ideal normative one whose relationship to social practice is not very well known, but it clearly implies a hierarchical structure based upon ritual distinctions. Like in the Jati system, the Brahmin and the Shudra stand poles apart in the social organization. Dayananda described these four Vedic classes as merely born out of the collectivity needs in terms of socio-economic complementarity, claiming further that status distinctions came at a later stage. He legitimizes the caste system under the garb of so-called ancestral Varna, incorporating certain individualistic values. Dayananda's reformism, far from contesting the social system, tries to protect its equilibrium, as confirmed by his recommendation relating to the strict endogamy of Varna. It is easy to recognize here the same processes of ideological reconstruction theorized by Geertz and Fellers. The Arya Samaj tries to evolve an ideology likely to vindicate an identity threatened by generally speaking, by the negation of its cultural quality. Here, the building up of a tradition through the invention of a golden age seems to be the natural formulation of a pre-nationalist ideology. This invention of tradition by the social-religious reform movements is of a special type because it is provoked by and modelled on the antagonist culture and its written-day ether and its content. Raja Mohan Roy and Dayananda Saraswati discover in the Vedas what they need to resist the Western influences. This is an ideology of strategic syncretism. Syncretism because there is a strong intention to reform one's society through the assimilation of Western values consistent with the Hindu cultural equilibrium, and strategic syncretism since the equilibrium in question remains the prime concern. This strategy combines two dimensions, the first one being directed towards psychological demands, the second being mimetic aspects of ideology building. Recovering self-esteem. In claiming that Vedic society was at least as monotheistic as and respectful of the individual as the best, the socio-religious reform movements attributed syncretic face to their history, the prestigious values the Europeans were so proud of first strategic moment, and tried to legitimize at the same time second strategic moment. Cultural institutions like the caste system under the idealized garb of the Varna. Underlying these arguments, a major aspect of the reformers' message was there was no need to leave Hinduism because of rationalist skepticism or to be converted, since this religion in its pristine purity had the same virtues as Christianity and the modern science. The only relevant objective is to re-establish this golden age of Hinduism and especially its Varna system. The sociological basis of this ideological strategy is easy to trace. Among the Hindus, the persons most willing to protect the cultural equilibrium belong to the high caste elite, not only because they aspire to preserve a privileged position, but also because they alone seem to have an overall view of that society. The Varna model, expounded in the Vedas with its organicist emphasis on the harmony of a complementary social system, is most likely a Brahmanic creation. Indeed, the leaders of the social reform movements come mainly from high caste intelligentsia. Hindu Mahasabha, socio-political history. Though the Hindu Sabhas entered into a federal structure in the second decade of the century in northern India, the Hindu Mahasabha was effectively launched as an ideological pressure group within the Congress party in 1922, very largely in relation to Hindu-Muslim riots that broke out in the wake of the Khilafat movement. In 1921, on the Malabar coast, the Mapplas, Muslim descendants of 19th century Arab merchants, provoked violence and forcible conversions that had a traumatic and catalytic effect on the Hindu Sabhaites, especially on leaders of the Arya Samaj. A context of aggression similar to a certain extent to the one created by Western penetration provoked an analogous reaction. Indeed, the ideological discourse propagated from the Hindu Mahasabha tribune until the 1920s during the Hindu-Muslim agitation reproduced strategic syncretism mechanism. At this stage, Hindu nationalists were inclined to identify certain values which they regarded as the basis of the Muslims' strength and solidarity, such as the avoidance of sectarian divisions, an emphasis on social cohesion, and to insist that these values could also be established within sect. RSS as a Hindu nationalist sect. Like the Hindu Mahasabha, the RSS took shape in 1925 in reaction to Hindu-Muslim riots. Founded by one of Moon Jay's lieutenants in Nagpur, Hedgewar, its aim was also to consolidate Hindu nation through a psycho-social reform involving some assimilation of others' egalitarian values. The method which it used, however, appeared to be much more relevant. Such an assimilation could not be achieved within the framework of the reinterpreted Varna system. Still, it was still a division true, fourfold only of the Hindu nation. So it attempted to create an ethic of selfless individualism which could provide the basis for a more inclusive and cohesive form of Hindu nationalism. The RSS was thus supposed to become a sort of Hindu nationalist spearhead based on individual solidarity. Its syncretism was strategic because it aimed at building a Hindu nation strong enough to resist these foreigners, and because it was seen as a mere elaboration of the familiar indigenous sectarian pattern. Marcel Mauss in his work starts an explanation by asking what sort of society deserves to be called a nation. He defines nation as follows: a society materially and morally integrated with a stable and permanent central authority with determinate borders, whose inhabitants possess a relative moral, mental and cultural unity and consciously adhere to the state and its laws. As we are all aware today that what initially started as awakening of the Hindu society to protect the cultural, geographical identity moved ahead in the future with the rise of aspirationist Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. It was founded by Keshav Baliram Hedgewar. This was also followed by the other establishments, which certainly included the institutionalization of Hindu Mahasabha in 1909, followed by the formation of All India Muslim League in 1906, and then also the reform movement of Arya Samaj, which began in 1875 by Swami Dayananda Saraswati. Jafar Lord writes in his book, The Sangh Parivar Reader. In his book, Hindutva, who is a Hindu, Sarvarkar considers that an Indian national identity is embodied in the Hindu culture, which encompasses not only Hinduism as a religion, but also as a language, Sanskrit. The worship of Hindustan as sacred land and the cult of the Vedic Golden Age. His motto was Hindu, Hindi, Hindustani. In Savarkar's views, the religious minorities are requested to pay allegiance to this dominant identity and hold back the manifestations of their faith within the private sphere. Jafar Lord further argues that the recurrent theme in belief systems is the identification of hostile forces which plot against the nation and which are responsible for the disruptive strains of the country. These forces are often identified with particular social groups which are usually defined as different, united and powerful. Christians consider themselves as a community, and it is this community orientation and not the dogma itself that is considered a possible impediment to their identification with the larger nation. RSS writers allege that Christian values have tended to distance Christians culturally from the national mainstream in some parts of the country. From this proposition, a sub-proposition is deduced. Because some Christians do not consider themselves culturally Indian, they do not experience a sense of community with other Indians. One could phrase the proposition in the same esoteric terms of the belief system. Because Christians are culturally different, they have separated themselves from the national soul. Jeffrelot cites an example where students who are taught in Christian schools of a tribal area in northern Indian state are typically Western and has no relation with Indian environment. It is these students who later demand for an independent Nagaland. The case against Islam follows similar trajectory, but Islam is viewed as a more serious problem because of the size of the Muslim community. The recent history of the communal animosity between Hindus and Muslims, and also due to the existence of Muslim states in the subcontinent. They look foreign lands as their holy places. They call themselves sheikhs and sayyids. Sayyids and sheikhs are certain clans in Arabia. How did these people come to feel that they are their descendants? That is because they have cut off all their ancestral national moorings of this land and mentally merged themselves with the aggressors. They think they have come here only to conquer and establish their kingdoms. Paraphrasing a leading RSS publicist, Anderson and Sridhar writes that democracy and capitalism join hands to give a free rein to exploitation. Socialism replaced capitalism and brought within it an end to democracy and individual freedom. The RSS belief system is often described as conservative and reactionary. There is little doubt that it represents a form of Hindu nationalism. The feeling of inequality of high and low, which has crept into the Varna system, is comparatively of recent origin. But in its original form, the distinctions of the social order did not imply any discrimination of big and small. In the context of RSS, Brahmanism and its social contradiction, it has been argued that, however, that egalitarian nature of the RSS was contradicted by the fact that for a long period of time, it has been associated with high caste people. The organization had been funded and developed by the Maharashtrian Brahmins. Hedgewar came from a Telugu Brahmin family, long resident in Nagpur, and Golwalkar was a Karhada Brahmin, and all the earlier Swayamsevaks were Brahmins. In his diary, Munja himself, a Dashastha Brahmin, referred to RSS members as Brahmin youths or Brahmin lads. V.S. Savarkar had codified the ideology of Hindutva after borrowing its ethnic nationalism from the West. Hedgewar undertook to implement it by providing Hindu nationalism with a social model of Hindu nation and more immediately with their solid organization. In this context, he emulated Western individualistic values under the pretext of reinterpreting other-worldly individualism inherent in the life tradition of asceticism. The pervasiveness of the Brahmanic ethic in the ideology and practice of the RSS was probably the main reason why it failed to attract support from the lower castes. RSS followed Sanskritized Hindu culture and championed the high tradition, and even the techniques are very much related to Brahmanic culture. There was anxiousness to transform the Hindu character into a nationalist ideology, and Hedgewar believed that it's important that shakhas could be inspired by the Hindu samsaras, which are considered to be Brahmanically illogical. The German influence and sources of Hindu nationalist ideology. Marcia Casolari, in her article, writes the inspiration and influence of Italian fascism on Hindu radicalism from the early 1920s. She argues that it's mainly after B.S. Munja's trip to Italy in 1931, and then later he attempted to transfer these values into Hindu society and organized it mainly militarily based on fascist patterns. She argues that the interest of Hindu nationalists in fascism and Mussolini must not be considered as dictated by occasional curiosity confined to a few individuals. It should be understood as culminating result of the attention that Hindu nationalists, especially in the Maharashtra, focused on Italian dictatorship and its leader. Fascism appeared to be an example of conservative revolution for the Hindu nationalists. This concept was discussed at great length by the Marathi press since the early phase of the fascist regime. Marathi journalists were impressed by the socialist origin of the fascism and that fascism was the new regime that was able to transform Italy into a new class power from a backward society. the Indian observers were convinced with the fact that fascism had been able to restore the order from political conflicts and tensions. The Marathi newspaper Kesari gave considerable space to the political reforms called out by Mussolini, in particular in the substitution of the election of the members of parliament and their nomination of the replacement of parliament itself with the Great Council of Fascism. Golwalkar also applied this nationalist ethnic reasoning to the Muslim minority, which posed a threat not only because it enjoyed the backing of a whole series of Islamic states, but also because it was a foreign body lodged into Muslim leader Maulana Muhammad Ali, who had died abroad, to direct his remains to be taken not to the land which he fostered him and his forefathers before him, but to the foreign land of Mecca. He argues that Muslims take themselves to be the conquering invaders and grasp for power, and therefore Hindus are at war at once with the Muslims and on the one hand and the British on the other. Conclusion, Module 24. In this module we have looked at Hindu nationalism. Nation is a construct, and how in the construct of the nation religion becomes a resource, and how this resource of religion, referring to Hinduism, has been able to mobilize the entire kind of communities across India in the name of Hindu nationalism. This is what we have looked at in this module. Thank you.